21:17 local time, somewhere in the open ocean. A fighter jet is descending toward the flight deck of a U.S. aircraft carrier. In just a few seconds, a single steel cable stretched across the deck will have to stop it. It weighs more than 20 tons and is moving at nearly 150 miles per hour. On land, an aircraft like this needs more than a mile of runway to slow down safely. Here, it has less than 300 feet. If that cable fails to stop it, the jet will just simply run out of runway and continue straight into the sea. Below the flight deck, inside a loud mechanical compartment filled with thick steel cables and massive hydraulic drums, one sailor is preparing for the moment of impact. He will never see the landing, but in a few seconds, he'll feel it. Every landing on an aircraft carrier depends on a system most people never even notice. A network of steel cables and massive energy absorbers designed to do something that sounds almost impossible. Stop a fighter jet traveling at highway speed in the distance of a small parking lot. Above him, the deck crew clears the landing area. Behind the ship, the approaching jet lines up with the angled runway. The pilot lowers the tailhook, and somewhere beneath the deck, the man responsible for the arresting gear waits for the moment when a thick steel cable suddenly goes from silent to violently alive. Miles behind the carrier, the fighter jet begins its final turn. From the cockpit, the ship looks small against the endless ocean, just a narrow strip of deck cutting through the water. The pilot lowers the landing gear and starts descending toward the angled runway. The aircraft is still moving fast, too fast to stop with brakes alone. Every landing requires the arresting gear to be set correctly for the aircraft approaching the ship. Different aircraft have different weights, different landing speeds, and different forces when the cable catches the hook. Too little resistance, and the jet might not stop in time. Too much resistance, and the sudden shock could damage the aircraft. So he adjusts the settings carefully. Above him, the flight deck is a controlled storm of motion and noise. The wind roars across the deck as the carrier turns into the breeze to help the aircraft land. The landing area is cleared. The cable is stretched tightly across the deck, and now the approaching jet is getting closer. From the operator's position below deck, there is no view of the aircraft itself, but he knows exactly when it's coming, because the entire ship begins to feel differently in the seconds before a landing. The deck crew goes silent, the radios crackle with final instructions, and somewhere above him, the fighter jet drops toward a runway that is barely longer than a city street. A fighter jet can't land on an aircraft carrier the way it lands on a normal runway. The problem is simple: distance. On land, military runways are designed to give fast aircraft room to slow down gradually. A typical runway can stretch 8,000 to 12,000 feet. That gives pilots time to reduce speed using wheel brakes, drag, and aerodynamic control. But an aircraft carrier doesn't have that luxury. The landing area on an angled flight deck is less than 300 feet long. That's shorter than the length of a football field. If it misses, the pilot must immediately apply full power and take off again in what is called a wave-off, which means that every landing depends on that one critical moment, the instant the hook meets the wire. Across the flight deck, several thick steel cables lie stretched from one side of the runway to the other. These are called the arresting wires. Each one is positioned so that when a landing aircraft touches down, the tailhook dragging behind it has multiple chances to catch one. From there, the purchase cable feeds into a massive mechanical system known as the arresting engine. This is where the aircraft actually slows down. Inside the engine, powerful hydraulic resistance absorbs the enormous kinetic energy created by a fast-moving jet. In just a few seconds, the energy of a 20-ton jet traveling at highway speed is converted into controlled mechanical resistance. Above the deck, this moment looks violent. The cable snaps tight, the aircraft jerks forward, the nose dips down as the jet is pulled to a sudden stop. The hook hits the deck. The cable moves. The arresting engine engages. Everything happens in literally seconds. And there's another pressure that most people never see. The pilot approaching the carrier is trusting that the system below deck is ready. Because at 150 miles an hour, there is no way for the pilot to verify it personally. He can't check the cable. He can't see the arresting engine. He can only trust that the sailor responsible for the system has done his job correctly. Which means that when the aircraft crosses the edge of the deck, that decision is already made. The settings are locked, the cable's ready, and in a few seconds the entire system will be tested by the full force of a landing fighter jet. Just before the landing, the aircraft carrier makes a slight turn into the wind. This is deliberate. By pointing the ship into the wind, the carrier increases the airflow over the deck, giving the incoming aircraft more lift and slightly reducing its landing speed. But even with that advantage, landing here is never stable. The ocean is always moving. The entire runway rises and falls with the waves. From the cockpit, the pilot must constantly adjust the aircraft's descent, keeping the jet aligned with the runway that is not only short, but it's also shifting beneath him. Below the deck, he knows that every landing comes with that uncertainty. He watches the system readings and keeps us focused on the arresting gear. Because when the jet catches the cable, the forces transmitted into the system depend on how the aircraft actually touches down. A smooth landing creates one kind of load, a hard landing creates another. And sometimes the aircraft arrives slightly off-center, pulling the cable at a sharper angle than expected. The arresting system has to handle all of that. Above him, the deck crew waits in position along the edges of the runway. No one stands in the landing area now. Everyone knows what happens in the next few seconds. The jet is on final approach. The pilot adjusts the throttle, balancing speed and lift as the aircraft descends towards the deck. From below, he cannot see the moment when the wheels touch down, but he knows the timing. Because right after touchdown, the tailhook will scrape across the deck. And if everything goes according to plan, the next sound he hears will be the cable snapping tight as the system he prepared suddenly absorbs the full force of the landing aircraft. The arresting cable may look simple on the surface, just a thick steel wire stretched across the runway. But when a fighter jet catches that cable, the forces involved are enormous. In a matter of seconds, the system has to absorb the energy of an aircraft weighing more than 20 tons moving at nearly 150 miles an hour. That energy travels through the wire, through the purchase cable, and into the arresting engine below the deck. He knows exactly how much tension that system is carrying. But if something fails under that load, the consequences can be immediate. One of the most dangerous possibilities is a parted cable. If a cable snaps while under tension, it doesn't simply just drop to the deck. It whips across the landing area with extreme speed, fast enough to seriously injure anyone standing in its path. That is why the landing area is cleared before every recovery. But the risk is not only to the crew. If the arresting cable system fails to absorb the aircraft's momentum, the jet could continue forward across the remaining deck. The pilot would try to apply full power to take off again. But if the aircraft has already lost too much speed, there may not be enough runway left to get airborne again, which means that the aircraft could reach the edge of the flight deck with nowhere left to go. That is why every setting he makes before the landing matters. The correct cable tension, the correct engine configuration, the correct preparation of the system. Because by the time the hook grabs the wire, the aircraft is already moving way too fast for anyone to intervene. Above the deck, the fighter jet finally reaches the runway. The wheels slam onto the flight deck. At that same moment, the tailhook drops lower and begins scraping across the steel surface behind the aircraft. Inside the compartment below, he waits. Then it happens. The hook catches the wire. In an instant, the steel cable that was lying motionless across the deck is yanked forward with tremendous force. Below deck, he feels the entire arresting system surge to life. The purchase cables begin racing through the pulleys. The arresting engine engages as the aircraft's momentum pours into the system. Above the deck, the jet is still moving at tremendous speed. For a fraction of a second, it looks like nothing has changed. Then the cable tightens. The aircraft jerks violently as the system begins absorbing the energy of the landing. The nose of the jet dips forward. The pilot is pushed hard against the harness as the aircraft decelerates in just a few seconds, from highway speed to zero. Below the deck, the machinery roars under the load. The cable continues feeding through the system as the arresting engine converts the aircraft's speed into controlled hydraulic resistance. He watches the gauges carefully. This is the moment the entire setup is tested. Thousands of pounds of force surge through the cables he prepared earlier. Then the movement begins to slow. The purchase cable stops running. The arresting engine settles. And above the deck, the fighter jet now sits motionless on the carrier runway. Another landing successfully stopped by the system he controls. Above the flight deck, the aircraft is now stopped. But the job isn't finished. In fact, for him, the next phase begins immediately. Below the deck, he watches the arresting system settle after absorbing the landing. The pressure drops, the cables slow, the machinery returns to idle. Now he resets the entire system. The purchase cable retracts back through the pulleys. On the flight deck above, the steel wire is pulled back into position across the runway. He checks the readings again. He confirms the tension. He makes sure that the system is ready to take another load. Because on a busy aircraft carrier, landings rarely happen one at a time. Another jet may already be circling behind the ship. Another pilot may be already descending toward the deck. And when that aircraft arrives, the entire system must work exactly the same way again. The same cable, the same machinery, the same sudden explosion of force when the hook catches the wire. So he finishes the reset, watches the gauges stabilize, and prepares the arresting gear once again. Because somewhere behind the carrier, another jet is already on its way. Think about that responsibility for a moment. He can't see the aircraft, he can't speak to the pilot, and yet the entire landing depends on the settings he prepared below the deck. Could you do that job, knowing that the pilot might only discover your mistake at 150 miles an hour? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, it would really help us to reach our first 1,000 subscribers if you would subscribe and like this video. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.